Okay. Not yet. One sec. How you doing, Ron?
I'm fantastic. How about you?
I'm doing well. You always have such a good attitude.
Smoke and mirrors.
Smoke and mirrors, right? I forgot I have a talk tomorrow to give. I should create slides.
Live now. Have fun.
All right. So here we are. We're live. Go time. What is the date today? Oh my gosh. Monday, May 9th. So this was supposed to be our day off, but we're not doing that. We're making up for missing last Wednesday. So I think we have, uh-oh, no video. Hold on. There we go. We've got video. I'm going to do black and white better. Hold on. We're going soon. Trust me. It's going to happen. There, better. All right, so welcome. This is class number 7, domain 4. Ron, you're watching, so hopefully you're keeping up with the chat and you can butt in anytime you want to. I'm just going to kind of get on a roll. This is class number 7, domain number 4. A lot of stuff to cover. Lucky you, I'm back. That's me. All right, so this is our agenda for tonight. Welcome. You got some welcome reminders, introduction. I did take some questions from the Slack channel, and we'll go ahead and go over those tonight. 173 slides, so should be plenty of time. And then we'll get into domain 4. We'll pick up where Christoph left off. He did a great job, but he covered a whole bunch of information in his class, but he caught us up. So, you know, kudos to him. We'll review a little bit and then get to a cheat sheet, secure network components, which is, I'm a network guy, so networking is kind of my jam. The good thing about it is the basics and the fundamentals of networking haven't changed over the last, not much anyway, over the last 15, 20 years or more. TCP/IP version 4 is still TCP/IP version 4. The OSI model is still the OSI model. So it makes it, you know, a nice class for me to teach with you guys tonight. And lots of testable goodies. So I'll try to point those out as I'm talking through tonight's class, the things that are testable. This is the 13th year for the CISSP mentor program. So we've heard a lot from people who have taken the test about what's testable, what's not. All these come from right from the CDK. So let's move on. Of course, there we go. Okay, housekeeping reminder. Just keep it respectful. You know, be yourself, be open, be honest, but keep it respectful and try to keep it on point. You know, a lot of people are here who may not see the world the same way you do. And that's okay. I mean, there's plenty of room for all of us here. So try to keep it on point, on topic, be respectful of other people. One of the things, you know, certainly in our industry is it can get pretty intimidating. There are people who have been around for a long time and know a whole bunch of stuff about information security, and sometimes it can get a little intimidating, especially when ego gets involved. So, you know, be respectful, realize that not everybody is on the same page as you, and try to spend some time and figure out how to get on the same page. Copywritten materials, so that means the book, the PDF of the book. I do have a PDF myself that I use. I prefer PDF, but I can't share it with you and I can't post it. Same goes for you. That violates the copyright and it does go against the ISC² canons. So please don't do that. Study tips. These have been in, I think, just about every slide. Study in small amounts frequently. Keep on it. Don't give up. Stick with it. I know it's a ton of information. It's a ton of memorization. Some of the stuff comes pretty natural. Some of it doesn't. It sort of depends on where you insert yourself sort of into the equation. Like I said, I was a network guy, so networking came really easy for me. So I did a lot of the technical stuff. The administrative controls, the people part of information security, the policies, procedures, guidelines, standards, that didn't come natural for me. Now, I think in general, the easiest way, into information security is from a technical background, but I know tons and tons of people who have come from a business background who really had no technical background at all, who are very successful in this industry. So just stick with it, keep at it. You'll be glad you did. And that I can promise. There's one, our industry needs you. We need more good people in our industry. And two, you can make a really good living, helping other people in this industry. So flashcards are good. Take these slide decks, go through those, take naps. I like naps. I actually took a nap before jumping on. Write things down, say them out loud. There's, all sorts of studies around how there's a direct correlation between the things you write and the things you remember. Use the Slack channels, participate. This is a community. We want to foster a healthy community, and Slack is one of those places we can do that. Hopefully some of the people you meet in the Slack channels will be, lifelong friends, as you kind of journey together. And exercise, get fresh air, do all those things. Don't try to master all this thing. And when I studied for the CISSP back in 2003-ish, maybe, I didn't do it right. I don't think. I read the book from cover to cover the first time, and it was 900 some odd pages. I didn't understand a thing I was reading. Well, the technical stuff I did, but the rest of it I didn't. Then I read it the second time, and I started putting kind of globs of information together, was able to put things sort of into big containers. And then the third time I read the book, I really focused on mastery. That did work for me, but that doesn't work for most people. Take the chunks, be healthy. You've got a family, you've got other things that you need to tend to as well, but stick with it. Huge thank you. These guys are just amazing. Christoph, he kicked butt last Monday, got us caught up with the schedule, covered a ton of information. I was going through his slide deck. I was really surprised how much he actually covered. Ryan, he's always here. He's right hand, left hand kind of guy who's somebody you can always count on. So huge thank you to Ryan. Ron is El Mejor Profesor, which is the best professor. He's got a knack for this, and just seeing him do his magic is really, really cool. Brandon, you probably don't hear about Brandon much, if at all, but he's the guy that makes sure you get your emails all the time, make sure that things get scheduled. He does a whole bunch of really cool things. And then huge thank you to the FRSecure, the unsung heroes that are either in the chat or supporting in various different ways. I call them hero-y things, and I'm certainly grateful for them. So thank you. That's in a whole bunch of different languages. I don't understand most of those. A couple of them I do. All right, so speaking of this is what, so Christoph last week, if you were here Monday, if you watched the video, he covered a ton of information. I'm just gonna go through it quick because I think we got to put this a little bit into context. So encryption, we talked about encryption, cryptographic methods, symmetric and asymmetric encryption, talked about PKI, hashing functions, all that kind of good stuff. So symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption, quantum cryptography, which really is just in its infancy now, but it was in the book, and I saw that he covered it in his slide deck. PKI, public key infrastructure. That's where we've got our certificate authority, which is really what, the key piece to it all. Validates the identities, issues those certificates, as well as public and private keys, and we use those in all kinds of different places. He covered digital signatures and digital certificates. He covered hash functions, cryptanalytic attacks, all sorts of different types of attacks against crypto. But then he went on to more. We got site and facility design. So he talked about site and facility security controls, and there's plenty of those. Restricted and work area security. He talked about utilities, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC. Our computers, like a controlled environment. So thankfully, we've made huge advances in computers over the years, but there was a time when you had to keep the server room in a really tight window in terms of heat. When something was too dry, you had to deal with static electricity. When things were too wet, you had to deal with corrosion. So humidity was a big deal. So he covered all that stuff as well. So it seems kind of disjointed to me when you talk about encryption, then you go right into physical security stuff, but that's all going to be on the exam. Fire prevention, detection, and suppression, talked about smoke alarms, talked about different types of fire suppression, whether it be a deluge system, whether it be a wet pipe system, a dry pipe system, pre-action system. I mean, there's all kinds of different fire prevention and suppression techniques that are covered. But then there's even more, because then he went into domain 4, which is where we're going to finish up tonight. And he covered a whole bunch of stuff, network defense in depth. This is a big piece. Now, one of the things with networks is if you didn't do it right out of the gate, you find yourself kind of in a bad spot. So many people over the years, we've built networks and we built it so it worked, right? But then when security was an afterthought, then you had to start talking about segmentation, and you had to start talking about isolation, where assume the attacker's already in your network. What's going to restrict their lateral movement throughout the network? And will you make it difficult enough to where you would detect them when something bad happened? And then would you have a response to it? So this whole defense in depth, and I've consulted way too many companies who didn't do this right out of the gate. And you get to a point where it's probably less expensive to just start over. And then what they end up doing, because that's disruptive to the business, is they end up just not doing it at all. So defense in depth, certainly if you have the opportunity to build defense in depth into a new environment, do it right out of the gate, which requires a whole bunch of planning. Where are you going to put certain, assets on the network? How are you going to isolate things? You're going to have a management network, you can have a server network, you maybe going to have some high value, systems in their own isolated environment, on and on, right? LANs, WANs, MANs, GANs, and PANs. So local area networks, wide area networks, metropolitan area networks, global area networks, personal area networks, and there are more, but that's probably enough for us now. And knowing the difference between those, he covered those: internet, intranet, extranet, DMZ, VLAN, and SDN. More. One of the things you'll notice certainly when you start talking technical is you get a whole bunch of acronyms, right? DMZ, that's demilitarized zone, and that comes from actually the military, where you had a demilitarized zone. We had a place where, it was things are exposed, so you wouldn't put your most valuable assets in a DMZ, but there were things that were on the front, right, that you would still, use and capitalize on for achieving some objective. Same sort of thing happens in a network. Usually things that are internet accessible are things that we would put in that DMZ, like a web server, mail server. Probably don't want to put your database server in your DMZ. VLANs, virtual local area networks, which is a layer 2 function. So switches are where we tag specific ports to belong to specific VLANs. He covered all of that. The OSI model, the 7 layers of the OSI model, you'll need to memorize that. It's so fundamental and foundational to so many parts of technical information security. So application presentation, session transport, network, data link, and physical. Those are your 7 layers going down. And he covered some good mnemonics for you. Like I said, I never learned the mnemonic way because I think I'm just old. But the OSI model, really, really important. We're going to use the OSI model tonight, because what we're going to do is we're going to plot some things, some equipment on the OSI model, and kind of explain how those things work. The TCP/IP model, that's the 4-layer model. We'll map that to the TCP/IP, or to the OSI model, sometimes referred to as the DoD model, the Department of Defense model. So TCP/IP, we're on version 4. Some places are using version 6, but most of us are still using version 4. he went through all of that good stuff. Encapsulation. So as things, the protocol data units. So you might have heard him say PDUs. Those protocol data units, as things come down the stack, down the OSI model, there's things that are added on a header and sometimes a footer, at the front of the packet and at the end of it, or the protocol data unit. And that's called encapsulation. So it's adding its data. So, and the reason why it does that is because on the other end, when the receiving system gets it, it's going to have to unpackage all of it so it can feed it back up to the application on the other side. So that's called encapsulation. And then on the other side, it's de-encapsulation. We strip that stuff off as it goes up, but that's all functional stuff. IP version 4, that 32-bit IP address. We talked about, routing, OSPF, BGP, RIP version 2, and all those things were covered in IP version 4 when he went through that. IP version 6, that's that 128-bit address. IPsec is built in. It's native to IP version 6. It's an add-on to IP version 4. That's one of the big differences between IP version, these two versions of TCP/IP or IP, is one was built without security, and so we tacked it on at the end. And then IP version 6 is built with security native. So IP version 6 is actually more secure if you configure it well, whereas IP version 4, it's a lot of band-aids and fixes. Network attacks, all kinds of different network attacks. Network attacks are they're fun when you're doing it legally. We'll just leave it at that. Secure protocols. Telnet is not a secure protocol. HTTP is not a secure protocol, and they're not secure because it's clear text. FTP is another insecure protocol. The secure protocols would be SFTP or SSH or HTTPS, right? Those secure protocols. He covered that. He covered microsegmentation. Microsegmentation is, really isolating things on a more granular level. Now, one of the truths about information security is complexity is our worst enemy. So going down the microsegmentation path, you just want to be careful not to add too much more complexity to your network because you're going to make your job harder. So he covered all that good stuff. What else did he cover? Wireless networks. So 802.11 is the IEEE standard for wireless networks. Talked about WPA, WEP, all that kind of good stuff. And that's what he covered. So that was Monday. That's a whole bunch of data. That's a whole bunch of stuff to cover. And so it's okay, I think, to be overwhelmed. It's okay to go through that a couple of times. It's okay to take your time, slow down a little bit. He went fast. And I know that I would be. I've been doing this for a really long time. And I would probably still be overwhelmed, trying to remember, all the details of what he covered. So relax. That's actually a picture. So I'm moving to Mexico in August. Yeah, let's call it August. And that's a picture outside that I took outside my my house in Mexico. It's beautiful. It's a really relaxing picture, and that's kind of why I have it. Maybe it brings some relaxation to you too, because it's okay. You need to relax. You have time. Probably nobody going to die if you don't get this done now and you don't nail it now. So take your time. You have time. And we're certainly here to help. Myself, Ron, Christoph, that whole group of people that I mentioned and gave thanks to. We're all here to help. We're all in this together. So let us help where we can. So that's that. Testable goodies, yeah. So that we're done with the welcome, reminders, introduction. Let's go on to questions. So the Slack channel is a great place to post your questions. It's a great place to answer questions. It's a great place to do research. It's a great place to foster that community. Take your more in-depth questions there. If you don't get a chance to get them answered in the YouTube chat, because I'm not even watching the YouTube chat. I'm guessing there are others who are helping there. take your more in-depth questions or the questions you didn't get answered and take it to the Slack channel. Don't feel like, and there's really no stupid question, so if you feel intimidated posting a question there, don't. I'm known for asking really stupid questions often. I actually, I was going to bring my wife. Well, I'll talk. My wife gets upset with me because I ask her questions about things that she just told me the answer to. So, don't be intimidated. Live session links, recording, instructor slide deck. We make all this stuff available. Any other resources that you find or want to post? I do have a study guide that I forgot to add to my slide deck tonight, but I will post it to the Slack channel so everybody can use that. It's a cheat sheet. So here's a question. Good morning. I have a question. Can a security assessment based on risk, low, mid, high, serve as threat modeling? Also, is it possible to get examples of a threat model, security plan, and due diligence plan so we can visualize the information in the book? And Ron, Ron's been out there a lot, so it's awesome, man. I can't say enough good things. I kind of wish Ron was here with us 13 years ago, but we got the best now. So he went out and answered that question. And so security assessment is kind of a generic term, but based on risk. So then, you assume that that's a risk assessment. So risk assessments, when you think of risk, because we just sort of skirt over this so often, risk is the likelihood of something bad happening, the impact if it did. The something bad happening, we call that a security incident. So it's the likelihood of a security incident and the impact of that security incident. Those are functions of threats and vulnerabilities. So a threat, compromises or exploits a vulnerability that leads to that incident. So threat is part of risk. So threat modeling is really, mapping out what those potential threats might be and then applying them to risk. So one feeds kind of into another. So this is a definition of threat modeling. Works to identify, communicate, and understand threats and mitigations within the context of protecting something in value. That's a definition. But yeah, do a whole bunch of research on this. Now, just within our industry, don't go too far down this rabbit hole, because in our industry, there's a whole ton of confusion around what these things actually mean. We have a language problem in our industry. So try to keep it kind of high level and focus on what it takes to pass the exam. And then if you want to go deeper and really ferret out a lot of these things, I would encourage you to do that. Do a whole bunch of research there. So here's another question. Was an informal session recorded yesterday? That would have been Wednesday last week. And yes, it was. We did. It was me, Ron, and Ryan, who all got online and just had a chat. Ron did a great job taking us through a whole bunch of examples and hands-on kind of things. So that is recorded. The link is in the Slack channel, but we didn't cover anything new. We just kind of rehashed things. But and I think we kept it to maybe just a little over an hour. So should be a good spend of your time. Does anyone have a security assessment template or guide for reviewing applications and/or software they can share? And OWASP is definitely the place to go for that. So thank you again, Ron. Good question and good answer. So here's another one. Do you consider natural disasters cybersecurity incidents? I heard some InfoSec pros say yes and some say no. What's your take? Now, when there's debate, I like to go literal. So that's what I usually do. So threat, the natural disaster itself potentially is a threat, unless you're talking natural disaster as being the event and the impact of the event. If you're just talking like a natural threat or a natural disaster, like a tornado or an earthquake, that would be the threat. The vulnerability would be, I like to use this as an example. Somebody explained it to me this way. What do you think is a higher risk, an earthquake in San Francisco or an earthquake in Boston? And most people, you know the context I'm asking the question, so you'll probably question it now. But if I just asked that on the street, most people would say, Well, the risk is higher in San Francisco because our minds generally go towards what's more likely, not the impact. It turns out that mathematically it's about the same. And the reason why it's about the same, the likelihood is higher in California than it is in Massachusetts. But the impact in Massachusetts would be tremendously worse because they don't build to the same code to account for earthquakes in Massachusetts that they do in San Francisco. So that would be an example potentially of a control gap in Massachusetts. They don't build them for that stuff, but the likelihood is much lower. Hopefully that's all making sense. But the incident at the end is the bad outcome, and that's the risk. Now, cyber literally is relating to or characteristic of the culture of computers, information technology, and virtual reality. So if that's the risk we're talking about, as opposed to information security risk, where we would also account for potentially people, the physical aspects of information security, that might be a little bit different. So this is sort of it's a question where I think you need more clarity around the question, but a great question because it really gets you thinking. I like questions like this because it makes you think more about, okay, this, how does this all fit together? So hopefully that makes sense. Right, the book mentions typo squatting, but did not offer any explanation of how to defend against it. Can you please provide? So I did do a little bit of just research on, how to prevent against or how to protect yourself against typo squatting. I provided a link there if you wanted to read a little bit more. One of the things you can do around typo squatting, because we've seen organizations get sort of stuck because they didn't try to trademark their domain. And so they really didn't have any ability to take down the typo squatted domain. Because that's one of the things you can do is if you can identify it and you've got your legal paperwork sort of all squared away, you can do takedowns, take down these malicious sites. So that would be one thing to do. Register the URLs. That could be easy misspellings. So, if you look at the keyboard and, the letters next to, potential other letters, or when you type it yourself, do you misspell it sometimes? Like sometimes I'll type, well, I'm not going to say, but I do. I mistype things a lot. If you need to send your users to third-party sites, just kind of be careful about how you use your URL structure. That will help to prevent others, your customers, from potentially falling into, getting victimized by typo squatters. There are some open source tools, DNS Twist being one of those, that you can run to see if, and there's many of them, to see if typo squatting is actually happening now. Some ISPs offer typo squatting protection as part of their offering. You can consider running your own DNS server, and then blacklist or deny list. Blacklist actually comes from a quote. I know we're changing those words now, of incorrect or forbidden domains. OpenDNS used to do it, but they actually pulled that service back. So it's a little different, but hopefully that helped. Ian, shout out to him for giving us a pretty cool CISO mind map. It's just a resource that you can use. Another one, reporting an administrative investigation. At what point do you involve law enforcement? It really depends. I'm always really careful with law enforcement. So in the organization that you're working for, you should already, as part of just your own incident management program, you should have already reached out to law enforcement to try to judge, who do I call? What's the phone number? Who are the people I'll be working with? So you can start establishing some sort of relationship with them. And you'll also get a pretty good understanding what their capabilities are. Usually you recommend against going to law enforcement for a couple of reasons. One, you lose control of the message. It's potential, if this becomes a criminal investigation, that this will go public. So others will find out about it. Whereas if it's just an internal investigation and you're going to handle it internally, maybe somebody gets fired or whatever, people don't necessarily find out about that. right? So just be really careful anytime you go towards, law enforcement. You should have it documented. You should have, like Ron said, have the legal department involved. But I always foster those relationships ahead of time. So I should know, like where I live here in Minnesota, I live in a small town called Konya. Here there is no city or town police. It's the sheriff's department, and the Carver County Sheriff Department doesn't have a very good cyber capability. So I probably wouldn't depend on them for much. Now, the FBI office here is very good, but they're not taking cases. In most of these instances, they wouldn't take the case because they have other things that they need to work on. So, but I would know that ahead of time. So hopefully that answers that question. OSI model, where does encryption occur? It occurs all over the place. It depends on, what encryption we're talking about. IPsec, for instance, typically happens at layer 4, maybe a little bit up to layer 5. SSL, TLS happens up to layer 6, 7. L2TP, which is layer 2 tunneling protocol. That doesn't really do encryption, but does tunneling that happens at layer 2 and relies on IPsec for the actual encryption. So it really depends. It'll be all over the place. So Ron, dead on again. It's often mentioned that security controls effectiveness should be tested. I think simple network security controls like firewalls or proxies, how their effectiveness should be assessed by network scans, by trying to assess some resource from the network. It is not supposed to reach the resource. Every test should have an objective. We should have what it is we're actually testing first, right? So if we're testing segmentation, well, then that's how we would design our test. If we're testing, the effectiveness of a firewall, that might be a little bit of a different test. We're testing the security controls of a web application. That would be a different test. If we're doing testing the resilience of our users, we might do, some mock phishing or, download tests or something else, right? So it really depends on what it is you're trying to test. But that would dictate the type of test you're going to run and exactly how you're going to run it. And Ron does give some good examples there of, ideas and places to go for that. All right, so that's the questions. Hopefully that provided some clarity and some value to you guys. Yeah, I forgot I had a dad joke. So what did one Dorito farmer say to the other? Oh, wait, just a second or two. Cool Ranch. Yeah. Okay. It's always weird when you tell dad jokes and there's no audience, or at least you can't see them because you're like, anybody get that? You good? I think we're good. All right, so secure network components. Now we're getting into the new material. We have 100 or so slides to get through for the new material, about an hour and a half. We're doing well. We're on page 334 if you're using Kindle. If you're using the book, I think that's the same page numbers. I'm not exactly sure. We left off right at content delivery networks where Christoph left us. So here, an introduction to key concepts. We're going to talk through what are the various types of network hardware, transmission media. So network hardware, transmission media, both very, very testable. Key concepts will also be very testable. Endpoint security, not as testable, but certainly relevant to today's environments and today's discussions. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. First thing, so with network equipment, everything, my rule of thumb for policy is if I don't have if the authority hasn't been granted to me in policy, I don't have the authority. So the policy is really, for me as a CISO or a vCISO, they're the rules for the game, and I don't deviate from those rules. because the policy is kind of, it has my back, right? If I find myself out on a limb somewhere. And if I want to do something that's not in policy, well, that's a great opportunity to update the policy, to consult the business on how we need to change our policies, potentially to add a few things. So policy, standards, guidelines, and procedures, and we've been through this before. Policies are mandatory. They're high-level documents. They should be non-technical. I like to use policies as reference documents, not as documents that are supposed to be read from page to page. It's almost like when you go to Target and you buy a new board game, and you open up the board game, and how many people read the instructions? Usually it's one, the person who's kind of going to run the game. In information security, that's like the CISO. And then your job is to then disseminate those rules so that everybody plays, by those rules. So policies are mandatory. They have to be approved by, the highest levels of the organization, the board, ideally, CEO, if there is no board. Standards are also mandatory. Standards take the policy down a level, make them a little more functional, a little more focused, usually related to specific technologies, specific maybe operating systems, things like baselines are generally, standards. Guidelines are not mandatory. Guidelines are just kind of tips and tricks and ways you can comply with policy. Procedures are also mandatory. Procedures are step-by-step instructions to accomplish specific tasks. You can always tell a procedure, especially if I'm somebody from the outside, if I'm a consultant and I don't work here, when I read a procedure, I should be able to do whatever it is the procedure was meant to do without any background on the systems, right? It should be that level of detail for procedures to be truly functional. So personnel have to be enabled, so they need to be trained. There's three things it takes to make a good security person. The first is intangibles. Those are things I can't teach you. Either you got it or you don't. It's things like dependability, honesty, integrity. That's number one. The next is education. And the last is experience. So intangibles, education, and experience. That makes a good, well-rounded information security expert. They need to be trained. You can't ask somebody to do something to maintain a firewall securely or a switch or a router if they've never been trained to do it. So we have to accommodate and account for that. We can't secure the things we can't control. So change control, access control, really, really important. Ideally, we built the network using secure configurations, secure guidelines. When you talk about vulnerabilities, when you talk about threats, exploiting or compromising a vulnerability, the two most common places you're going to find vulnerabilities is going to be an insecure configuration. So somebody didn't set it up right. That would be like default credentials or just a crappy configuration. That's one place. The other place is software flaws. So everything's got software flaws. These are written by, the programs and the applications are written by human beings, and human beings make errors on average, maybe 5 to 10 errors per 1,000 lines of code. We call that a K-lock. So when you do the math, you find out that there's quite a few errors in my Macintosh computer, in your Apple, in the router, in your next generation, firewall. So we start with a secure configuration, and then deviations from that secure configuration should all follow change control. If we did this really well, and we have good control of the environment, if we see changes to the configuration that didn't go through change control, we would generally consider that to be an incident because somebody didn't follow process or we've been hacked, right? So control is really, really important. And then knowing that security is about risk management, it's not about risk elimination. That means I can't possibly prevent all bad things from happening. Where I can't prevent a bad thing from happening, do I have the things in place to detect it? And then would I have a response? So what I can't prevent, I have to be able to detect. The average dwell time today, I don't know what it is, because our data is usually kind of all over the place, but say it's 120 days. It means that's how long an attacker dwells in the environment before anybody even notices that they're there. That's should be unacceptable. And it's probably because we didn't have adequate monitoring in place. Other considerations to include in the secure network components, certainly in inventory, we can't protect the things we don't know we have. Redundancy on certain systems that are key and very, very important. The core of a network, we would probably want it to be redundant. We also have to account for, maintenance, secure maintenance procedures. Everything requires maintenance, everything. All right, so firewalls. That's where we're going to start. So we're starting sort of somewhere in here. We talk about the OSI model, and I'm going to plot the different types of firewalls on the OSI model so you have a visual representation of where they fit. Most of the diagrams you see around firewalls are, they look like this. It's focused on keeping the bad actors out, the bad guys, bad girls, bad whoever out. But that's not all that a firewall is used for. One is ingress, so keeping bad things out. The other is keeping good things in. That's how firewalls are supposed to be used. So default deny, ideally. So default deny on the way in. So we're only permitting traffic that's specifically required for authorized business functions for things to work. The same goes outbound. So having a server, for instance, a file server or a database server that can FTP out, why? Or SMTP, it's not a mail server, it's a database server. So doing the default deny for outbound traffic is as important as the inbound traffic. And one of the things you'll find is if you're doing this in a newer, or not a newer, an older environment where they haven't done this well before, it's not uncommon. And actually, I've done this enough times to where I will have an incident response plan developed and ready before I do it, because it's not uncommon to start restricting egress traffic and find that you've already been compromised because there's command and control traffic outbound. Command and control is, so attackers usually will maintain some level of persistence on the internal network or on some assets somewhere. And that persistence is how they can control or leverage. They're going to use it to pivot into another part of the network. That's that lateral movement I was talking about, or they just come back later. They haven't really decided what they're going to use this for yet, or whatever, but that's that persistence. In order to maintain that, you have to have some command and control traffic. And, the SolarWinds was a great example here. So SolarWinds, you probably heard about it. If you didn't, you can Google the SolarWinds attack. It happened, it's over a year ago now. That was a really, really big deal. Because it affected a whole bunch of people, and it was kind of a new attack vector that we hadn't really seen before. There was one organization that didn't get compromised, that had the SolarWinds software running, and it was infected, and that was the IRS. So the Internal Revenue Service wasn't affected. They were affected by, they had the bad software and all that other stuff, but there was no command and control, and that's because they had run egress filtering on the firewall. It only allowed specifically authorized traffic outbound. And one of those traffic flows was, not the command and control, so it was stopped. So that's how important it can be, because you could have mitigated that attack. You wouldn't have mitigated it from the supply chain because we don't have control over that. But we would have mitigated the command and control because we wouldn't have been permitting that egress traffic. So that's a big deal. So firewalls stop unwanted or unauthorized network traffic based upon rules. So we set up a firewall based on rules. This is allowed. This is not allowed. There are wildcards that you can put into firewalls to allow, entire subnets. You can do any, unless it's any deny, which most firewalls have an implicit deny at the end of the firewall rules or the chain. But whatever the rules are for however I've set up the firewall. If I've configured it poorly, well, then you've got vulnerabilities, right? And hopefully you're accounting for those in your risk management. Creates a boundary. So not just a boundary between public and private networks. We also could and should use firewalls for network isolation inside of our network, isolating, PHI, systems that are storing PHI from client systems that don't have any need to ever access that data. That's another type of boundary. One of the big things that happens in healthcare today is a lot of the medical devices can't be updated on a regular basis. They can't be patched on a regular basis because they've got FDA rules to deal with and a whole bunch of other reasons. So there are many hospitals today that are running medical devices that are flawed, that have publicly available exploits out there. One of the strategies to reduce the risk is to do microsegmentation or to isolate those networks with internal boundaries so that nothing can really access them, right? The attackers can't get at them. So perimeter firewalls between public and private, internal firewalls between various security domains, depending on how you've configured or set up your network. Default deny is the most secure. But it's also the most work, right? One of the reasons why Kevin Mandia, when I mentioned the attack, the SolarWinds, you could have mitigated the attack without any new, didn't have to have any next gen anything in order to mitigate that SolarWinds attack. But Kevin Mandia made a point in that Senate testimony. He's the I guess the founder of Mandiant, which now is owned by Google, whatever. Big name in our industry. But he said that default deny, or essentially running a firewall the way it's supposed to be run, is operationally cumbersome. I mean, it's a lot of work. I like work, and I think we kind of get paid for that. So, but anyway, must be maintained like any other piece of hardware running software. Hardware by itself doesn't do anything, right? It just sits there. It needs to have software to do anything. So anything on a network has software behind it somewhere. It's not just a piece of hardware. There's software running. And we need to, maintain our access control, change control, patching, all that stuff. Critical events should be logged. If we don't know what those critical events are, most firewall manufacturers, there's also good practices, STIGs. You can check out the secure, I can't remember what STIG stands for, but STIGS, CIS controls. CIS has some good benchmarks. You can check with the manufacturer. Most manufacturers have good documentation on how to maintain their equipment. So, if you have Cisco stuff, Cisco will have good guidance on what should be logged. Generic events that should always be logged, obviously reboots, access control changes, permissions changes, software updates, faults, things like that would be critical events that I would want to know about as a network administrator so that I could respond to it. The thing about computers and technical things, and one of the reasons why I actually like technical stuff so much is, unlike people, technical things, computers only do what they've been told to do. That's it. They will never have a mind of their own and just go off and do, even if we think they will with AI, somebody still programmed the AI. They still only do what they've been told to do. Eventually they sort of can emulate like they're thinking themselves, but still it's coded. Whereas people, they're analog creatures, right? They're all over the place. They're really hard to figure out. But and the reason why this is important is because if something was logged from my firewall, there's a reason why it was logged. We don't just blow it off and say, well, Well, I guess something weird happened. No, especially on a firewall, we need to do root cause analysis. We need to figure out why it did what it did, because we may have an incident in our hands. That's the whole point of monitoring. All right, so 4 basic types of firewalls: stateful, or I'm sorry, static packet filtering firewall, application level firewall, stateful packet inspection or stateful inspection firewalls, and circuit level firewalls. All different types of firewalls. The first is static packet filtering. This is where it sits on the OSI model. It sort of straddles between layer 3 and layer 4. And it does that because it's going to make forwarding decisions based on static rules. And those rules are going to be essentially source, IP address, source port, destination IP address, destination port. Now those ports run at TCP, right? So those are those ports. It's a socket, it's called, when you put those together. And it's going to make routing decisions based on that, right? So it's not strictly IP. It's not strictly ports, but it's going to use those for making routing decisions, and back in, both ways. But that's it. It's going to be source, destination IP address, source, destination port. That's all a static packet filtering firewall can make decisions on. Also called the screening router. Super fast, simple. I like simple, but also very easy to bypass. And the reason why it's easy to bypass is because it doesn't maintain any state, meaning a static packet filtering firewall won't know if this is a response. So remember we talked about, or maybe you talked about the 3-way handshake with TCP. It's SYN, SYN-ACK, and ACK-BACK, right? So in a stateful firewall, I would have maintained the state. I saw the SYN packet go out. So I would expect the SYN-ACK to come back, and I would match that, right? So I would permit that traffic back in, and then I would permit that, that acknowledgement back. Whereas a stateful packet filtering, a static packet filtering firewall that doesn't maintain state, it never saw or it never maintained a record of that initial SYN packet. So it's going to get a SYN-ACK back. It's going to see the SYN-ACK coming in, and it's going to assume that this is a response to a SYN packet that went out. So it's probably going to let that traffic pass, and that's a very easy bypass for a screening router. That's how that works. So fast, because it's very simple decisions, simple, easy to make, to set up, easy to do all kinds of stuff with, but super easy to bypass, and it's the least secure of these 4 types. Application level firewall. So like it says, application, the top layer of the OSI model, layer 7. Actually, top layer you might say is the people layer, the soft layer on layer 8, but a whole nother thing. So top layer, so it's in the name. So tie that to the level, and the higher we get up in the OSI model, the more decisions we can make because we have access to more data. So application sits way up there at layer 7. And there's a lot more functionality because now we can look into the actual data stream. We can see, the different types of compression that were used, the types of encryption that were used, just basically anything with that network traffic, and make those decisions. So super duper flexible, slower for sure, more complex. This puts the onus then back on the training piece again, because the more complex we make things, the harder it is to secure. We got to be careful when we're doing that, but very secure. Also sometimes referred to as gateways or proxies. You can set up an application level firewall to not be a proxy. When you think of a proxy, you think of acting on behalf of. So that would mean that the firewall would terminate the traffic on one side and reinitialize the traffic on the other side. It is essentially playing the middleman between the two. That's what a proxy does. There are application level firewalls that don't do true proxy, but in general, for the test, this is good. Then we have that stateful inspection firewall. So I already talked about the static packet filtering firewall. This is essentially the same, but it's going to maintain a state. So it's going to sit at that same layer, but it's going to maintain a record of what's going in and what's coming out. So it would not allow that SYN-ACK packet to just come back, because unless there was a SYN packet that it could marry it with on that three-way handshake, right? And that's just one example. The three-way handshake, it would be with all data flows. We would expect to see these back and forth, and the stateful inspection firewall can make those decisions. So it's like the static packet filtering firewall, but maintains a state. It's a state table. And I don't know if you've ever seen this with older firewalls that were stateful inspection firewalls, but there were times when, and I don't think it happens anymore, but there were times when that state table would get gummed up. So if you were running like Nmap scans, for instance, an Nmap scan, if I was scanning an entire subnet potentially on maybe the top 1,000 ports, right? That's a whole bunch of state entries coming from my computer that this stateful inspection firewall is going to have to maintain. And there were times when you could just overwhelm its memory and essentially render it ineffective, and then you'd have to reboot the thing. That doesn't happen as much anymore, but there was a day when memory was a huge premium. So fast, harder to bypass, but it doesn't see the data. Not like the application level firewall. It doesn't see anything above it, right? Above that, it doesn't see any session data, no presentation data, no application data, none of that. It doesn't have visibility. Then we have circuit level firewalls. Circuit level firewalls live here. So they live squarely in layer 5 of the OSI model. Operates like a stateful packet inspection firewall. It also can't see data, right? So that happens at layer 8, so it can't make data-driven decisions. Whereas an application level firewall, sometimes you can make routing decisions on specific commands, right? On an application, because the application level firewall sees that stuff. Circuit levels, these others don't see that. Now, it sort of serves as a semi-proxy, and I say a semi-proxy is because the traffic that goes through a circuit level firewall, because it'll terminate the connection and reestablish the connection and look as though it's coming from the gateway and it's not coming from the host. But there are some circuit level firewalls that it's not truly serving as a proxy. I think for the exam, if you just think of it as being proxy, you're probably going to be safe. So hopefully that answers those things. Next gen firewalls, I say advanced because these, really what we did is we collapsed functions. I'm old school, so so my bias is going to show a little bit. I like to buy, I like a hammer to be a hammer. I like a saw to be a saw. I don't like to have multi-purpose tools. So I didn't mind having multiple systems running different things because I had more control over the network. This is where we collapse a whole bunch of different functionality and put it all into one chassis or one system. So that's essentially what most next generation firewalls do. There's certainly improvements over time. Things are faster, more capable. But things that we would collapse into a next generation firewall potentially would be intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems. Next generation firewalls typically serve as application level firewalls, so they can see data into everything. Sometimes these next generation firewalls and application level firewalls, they won't be able to see any encrypted traffic unless we configure them to do so. And then it truly does have to be a proxy, because then you're negotiating the connection, the encrypted connection between the host and the firewall, and the destination and the firewall, because you have to have that decryption on both sides. Yeah, and then the difference between intrusion detection. I think we probably talked about NIDS, HIDS, NIPS, and HIPS, host-based intrusion prevention, network-based intrusion prevention. Do I consider a unified threat management network system to be a next generation firewall? In general, probably. I would have to, nowadays, there are so many different technology variations that I would have to compare feature to feature. But yes, UTMs are typically synonymous with next generation firewalls. So good question. All right, so that's all that good stuff. So now different architectures. So different architectures, a multi-homed firewall is a firewall that has multiple network interfaces, right? And it can be essentially unlimited. This is a very, simple illustration where you've got one network interface for the DMZ, another network interface for internal, and another network interface for external. So everything runs through a single firewall. Well, you could have these as redundant too, right? We could have an active passive, or, be fully redundant system here, but simplest form of multi-home firewall is just multiple interfaces, right, on one system, one chassis. Another type is a bastion host or screened host, and a bastion host is essentially it's almost like a sacrificial lamb in a way, but all the traffic should go through the bastion host from the untrusted network, and it will think of it as a jump box. I think that's legit. This is a different type of firewall architecture. Not super common, but it'll be on the test. So that's that. Screen subnet. Now, I'm not a big fan of screen subnet, but a lot of people are. So you'll need to know it for the test. A lot of it comes down to preference. That's where you have a firewall, two separate firewalls. So the first firewall would control, an untrusted something on one side, a more trusted something on the other side, and then you have another firewall that would treat this basically the same thing. So you have to go through two firewalls to get from, in this diagram, from the enterprise local area network to the internet. Now, the theory here is if you compromise one of the firewalls, then you haven't compromised the other, right? So you've got another potential layer of defense. The trade-off is complexity, right? Because now you have two firewalls to maintain, you have two sets of vulnerabilities to maintain, you have two code bases to maintain, you've got two access, two different things to maintain. So it's always going to be a trade-off, but that's what risk management's all about, right? So, that's how it is. I've worked in some government networks where they had a 5-tier architecture, redundant, and each one of the screened subnets had to be run by a different firewall manufacturer. So what we ended up having was 10 firewalls, 5 different manufacturers. Maintaining that environment was a nightmare because I was a Cisco guy, so I knew back then it was the PIX firewalls. I knew the PIXs like the back of my hand. I was not a Dragon firewall guy. I could figure it out, but you don't want a guy to figure it out. You want a guy who's going to be awesome at it. So the Dragon wasn't my jam, but I also wasn't much of a checkpoint guy. I was a Cisco guy. So you can see how this can become, screen subnet, not always the best, but for the exam, this is what you're going to need to know. In today's complexity, and I took this quote because I'm one of those guys where sometimes I can't keep my mouth shut either. Like if I see something I disagree with, I just have to say it. Not to say that I'm right either, because I'm wrong just as often as I'm right, probably more. But in today's complex computing environment, a single firewall in line between the untrusted and private networks is almost always insufficient. I have trouble with that because it's not the firewall that's going to be the problem. It's going to be the person running the firewall that's going to be the problem. So I don't think it's insufficient. I wouldn't bust somebody over, having that. And then others. So other types of architectures, there's really limitless numbers of architectures. AWS has their security groups, which is virtual private cloud stuff. You have firewall as a service now. Firewalls is one of those things where I don't trust anybody else to run my own firewall. I want to run my firewall myself. So, but again, that's preference. And then for the test, this is what you need. This is just a screenshot of what the AWS firewall looks like. You have the firewall manager, security group policies, and you deploy those out between your virtual your private clouds. That's, really basic about how that works. All right, so switching gears, firewalls. That's basically all I'm going to talk about with firewalls tonight. And now we're going to go back to the OSI model but I'm going to keep that stuff there. And first thing I'm going to add, you can see in the bottom right, is repeaters and hubs. These are the dumbest of the dumb devices. And when I say dumb, it means they have the least amount of capabilities, least amount of visibility, least amount of logic. So to me, they're sort of dumb. Repeaters and hubs. And that's why I got the dumber and smarter on the left. Maybe that helps you, maybe it doesn't. But repeaters and so all a hub is a multi-port repeater, right? A repeater, all it does is regenerate signal. It's to fight against what we call attenuation. So over a long period, well, depending on the media, fiber, you can go a lot further than you can with, say, unshielded twisted pair. And we're going to talk about those different cabling types. Over time, there's going to be attenuation. The signal is going to degrade. And so if I wanted to regenerate that signal, I would potentially put a repeater in place. So connect the two networks. They have to be the same kind. There's no translation between different types of networks. Protocols have to be the same. The layer 2 stuff all has to be the same because repeaters can't do anything with any of that. This is what's called a collision domain. So when we say collision domain, that means everything on that network can talk as it wants. And if you get enough network traffic, it's going to bounce back and forth, and you're going to have collisions. And whenever there's a collision on a network, you have to resend essentially the signal or the message. So a hub is the same as a repeater, but it's a multi-port repeater. No traffic filtering. What goes in one port goes out all others. When you talk about a hub, there's a 5-4-3 rule. Excuse me. Excuse me. 4 repeaters in a row. So the 5-4-3 rule is 5 segments, 4 repeaters, 3 have additional connections. So if you have 5 segments, 4 repeaters connect those 5 segments. Only 3 of those can have other things on them. That's the 5-4-3 rule. Now, hubs are a security risk, and the reason why a hub is a security risk is there's no filtering. So if I plug in as an attacker, if I plug into a hub that's plugged into, say, a trunk port on a switch, I'm going to see all that data, which is great if I'm eavesdropping or man in the middle or whatever I want to do with that. So every time we see a hub, it's usually a no-no, right? That should not. Now, for legitimate network troubleshooting purposes, it may make sense to have a hub and occasionally put it in line and pull it out, but it's not something to keep in production at all. So the one on the top left, that's what a repeater looks like. So you've got one connection that you're seeing there. You've got another one on the other side, and that's all it does. Takes it in, regenerates the signal, and sends it back out again. On the bottom, that's an old school hub. You've got the coax connection on the far left. This brings back memories. And then you've got those twisted pair ports, the 8 ports in the front. So anything that came in any one of those ports is going to go out all the other ports, including the coax port. That's a repeater, and that's a hub. So the next one is bridges and switches. Works a lot the same as repeater and hub. A bridge is essentially 2 ports, one this side, one that side. A switch is a multi-port bridge. Everything that a repeater and a hub does, a switch and a bridge does. This builds on top of it. So it also regenerates signals. It also forwards on traffic, but there's a little bit more to it. This operates at layer 2, so there's a little more functionality. There's a few more things we can do. One is we have visibility into the MAC address, right? That MAC address, the media access control, that's one of the 2 layers, right, of the data link layer, also known as the hardware address. I can now make some decisions on where to forward data based on that layer 2 address, that MAC address. Layer 1, we can't do that stuff. So can connect 2 networks to the same protocol, because the other protocols like IP and God forbid IPX, SPX, or Apple Talk or whatever, those other protocols if they're different protocols, it's not going to work. They just connect different physical types and speeds together. They also repeat and regenerate that signal. They filter traffic based on MAC address. This is where the collision domain gets broken down. So take a bridge, for instance. A bridge will maintain a MAC address table. It will maintain a table of where it saw different MAC addresses. So if I saw this MAC address come in, say MAC address A, just to simplify it, MAC address A came in on the left side. So all the data that's addressed for MAC address A is just going to stay over there. It's not going to go over to the other side because I already know that MAC address A is over here. MAC address B is over here. Same thing happens. So if MAC address B wants to talk to MAC address A, it would then traverse the bridge. Otherwise, they'll just stay on either side. Now, the same thing happens with a switch, but it's now multiple ports, right? So a switch will also learn what MAC addresses were on which ports, and it'll maintain a table of that. And so if the good thing too is then rather than coming in one port and going out many, if I already know, the switch already knows that this MAC address is on port 3, it comes in, whatever port, it's only going to send it to that port 3, unless it doesn't understand, unless it hasn't already learned the MAC addresses, then it's going to broadcast out all until it learns it. But that's the collision domain, breaking up those collisions. Now, it doesn't break up a broadcast domain. That happens at layer 3, which is what routers do. And there's a little mention in the book about spanning tree algorithm. We don't have to get crazy in the spanning tree algorithm, but spanning tree algorithm, when I connect multiple bridges together, those are called trunk ports. And without spanning tree algorithm, there's a good potential that you'll have bridging loops, right? So things will continue to bounce back and forth on the network because it can't find where it's supposed to go. Spanning tree algorithm would suppress that through the learning process. So that's bridges and switches. That's what a bridge looks like. So collision domain over here, collision domain over there, hubs, whatever. That's what a bridge looks like. Probably never going to see one in real life. And this is what a switch does. So switch, we've got multiple ports now and breaking up those collision domains, and that's what a switch looks like. That's an old school switch. Those kind of switches, actually, yeah, memories. We've got this other thing called VLANs that happen in switches. And really what happens with a VLAN is on the switch, in the configuration of the switch, we tag specific ports to belong to specific VLANs. Now, switches themselves cannot route between VLANs. You see it says layer 3 switch. In a true function of a switch, there's no such thing as a layer 3 switch. That's a router who does switching. Yeah, for the exam, keep layer 2. Switches don't do routing. Routers do routing. But I could tag VLANs. VLAN would be network segmentation, not isolation. You need, additional logic for that, but this is, segmentation. So switches operate at layer 2. There is no routing capability. Switches can segment networks using VLANs, but cannot route between VLANs without a router. And that's done through tagging ports on the switch. So that brings us to the next thing. That's the router. The router allows us to go between VLANs. Operates at network layer 3. 2 networks of the same protocol can be joined together, but now we can introduce different topologies, different technologies. So Ethernet, token ring, ArcNet, whatever. Those other layer 2 technologies can all be routed through a router because the logic is there. They also repeat and regenerate the signal. They filter traffic based on IP address. So that's the logical address. So logical address at layer 3, physical address at layer 2, breaks the collision domain and the broadcast domain. So whenever you hear collision domain, think layer 2. Whenever you hear broadcast domain, think layer 3. And layer 3 would do all the stuff layer 2 does as well. Determines the best route path through the network. And I think Christoph already talked to you about different routing protocols. BGP border gateway protocol, that's an exterior gateway routing protocol. OSPF, open shortest path first. IGRP, Interior Gateway Routing Protocol, EIGRP, which you'll never see in the exam because that's proprietary to Cisco, that's extended or enhanced. Interior Gateway Routing Protocol, and then you've got the Routing Information Protocol, just different routing protocols. So if you hear these acronyms, you know that they're routing protocols. You may see on the exam an example of where RIP might make more sense than potentially OSPF. I'm guessing you would only see 3 potential routing protocols on the exam: BGP, OSPF, and RIP. BGP would only be used for routing between autonomous systems, external, right? External. So if you ever hear external, that'd be the Border Gateway Protocol. OSPF does things called areas. So you have an area 0, and then multiple other areas. It routes between areas. It maintains a full state. It can make routing decisions based on speed, based on, it builds a whole topology of the network, right? So it makes very educated routing decisions, whereas RIP doesn't. RIP is, what did I hear from my neighbors? Yeah, so hopefully you guys covered that, pretty well, and you're squared away on that. But that all happens at layer 3. It's just more of a functional network architecture. If you wanted to beat this up, you certainly could, but it's just an example. You can see, and the point with this diagram is you see the additional functionality and additional complexity that happens here because your routers give you that ability. All right, and then we've got gateway. Far left, all 7 layers of the OSI model. Gateways can operate at all 7 layers. They connect 2 networks, different protocols together, doesn't matter. They do what's called protocol translation, protocol translators. Repeat, regenerate the signal. Gateways can do, they can translate between IP version 4 and IP version 6 because that stuff happens lower down. They do all the things that the lower levels do, but a whole bunch more. Gateways are usually dedicated to a specific type of network traffic or specific function. So a data gateway, a mail gateway, so on and so forth. That's typically how they work. Proxies are a type of gateway. They can operate also at all 7 layers. Proxies do not translate protocols. That's the big difference between a gateway and a proxy, is proxies do not translate. They act on behalf of hosts and hosts. They completely hide the source from the destination and vice versa. There's that thing called network address translation. And I think you probably already talked about that with Christoph as well. We talked about the different types of network address translation and port address translation, all that good stuff. SOCKS also comes about here because SOCKS is a proxy. What it stands for is the secure or socket secure. It's a layer 5 protocol. So it's not truly like a proxy where we talk about all 7 layers, obviously. It terminates at layer 5. And they route, different types of traffic based on, and usually you have to have a SOCKS client, installed. You probably won't run into SOCKS all that much, but if you run into it on the exam, this is really all you need. A couple of other things. LAN extender, which really gets confusing with a repeater, and essentially it works kind of the same thing, but this works at layer 2, but it doesn't have all the functionality of layer 2. It can just translate between maybe Ethernet and different Ethernet cable types, whereas a repeater won't be able to do that. You'd have to have the same cable type for that. It's also called an Ethernet extender. We'll talk about the limitation through the 100 meters. That'd be 100 base whatever, which is 328 feet. That's where the attenuation has become so degraded that the network data is no longer useful. You'd potentially put a LAN extender in there. Usually LAN extenders are temporary fixes, like band-aids. You don't leave them there forever. And then wireless access points, layer 2, you discussed that last week as well. All right, so now on to local area network technologies, Ethernet 802.3. So anytime you see 802 dot anything, that's an IEEE standard. So 802.3, 802.5 for token ring, 802.11 for wireless. There's a whole bunch of 802 dot somethings. 802.3 is the most common LAN technology used today. Usually the topology, meaning how it's all laid out, is a star or a bus topology, star being far more common. Bus is where it started. Two-way full duplex communication. So you probably talked about duplex as well last week. PDU for Ethernet is a frame. So PDU being the protocol data unit. And I think if you go back to this OSI, do I have PDUs listed here? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there you go. Packets, frames. You can see them there. But the PDU for layer 2 or Ethernet is a frame. The carrier sense multiple access collision detection is the access method or methodology. I assume you also talked about that last week, but this is what Ethernet works and what it does. Different types of Ethernet. You've got fast Ethernet, 100 megabits per second, gigabit Ethernet, 1,000 megabits per second. You're always going to have some overhead too, so you're not truly ever going to get exactly what it says because you have things along the way that will slow things down a little bit. 10 gigabits, 10 gigabit Ethernet usually for potentially a backbone, but they've got 400 gigabit Ethernet and beyond. They've got terabit Ethernet now. And when you talk about like fiber, really fiber optics in particular, the bandwidth potentially is infinite, right? Because you can use a prism to break down different data streams into different colors, and theoretically there's an infinite number of colors in light. So pretty cool stuff what they can do with all those goodies. But for the test, I think knowing the differences between Ethernet, knowing the stuff that's here on the slide is probably going to be plenty for you. 802.11, so that's Wi-Fi. That's, and again, another IEEE standard. Two modes of operation are important for Wi-Fi. One is infrastructure mode and the other is ad hoc. The difference is infrastructure is a client server mode where you've got specific wireless access points and the clients can only connect to wireless access points. That's infrastructure mode, whereas ad hoc mode is peer-to-peer. So the infrastructure mode is obviously more secure, easier to control, and it's not uncommon for us to disable the ability to do ad hoc mode, so you don't have those peer-to-peer connections, because you could potentially use that as a pivot too, right? If I've got a infrastructure mode and ad hoc mode running on potentially two different network interface cards, I can use that as a way into the network. No physical media, transmission over radio waves. The difference between Ethernet, we had collision carrier sense multiple access collision detection. Wireless is always carrier sense multiple access collision avoidance. A little more overhead with that. And I think you probably talked last week about frequency, spectrum analysis and jumping frequencies and all that good stuff. All right, cabling. So coaxial cable. You've seen coaxial cable probably. The center core is copper, and then it's got multiple layers of either insulation, conducting shield. The shielding is used for two reasons. The shielding is actually used in communication. So it's not just the copper core that's being used in communication. The braided shielding layer is also being used in the bidirectional communication. But the secondary purpose of it is it does restrict on attenuation because so I can carry it typically further because the signal will stay within the shield for a while. It also protects against crosstalk. So when I put two cables next to each other, occasionally there's crosstalk that happens. I don't know if people still use phones, plain old telephone service, but it wasn't uncommon to pick up a phone and hear somebody else's conversation. That's crosstalk. You're hearing somebody else because the cables are run too close together without proper shielding. So their communication was coming onto your wire. That's crosstalk. Also, it's a little bit, the better the shielding is, the better I can run it across potentially fluorescent lights, other, kind of high interference places. So that electromagnetic, I've got stories, lots of stories for the old days. Yeah, I'll tell you about them someday. It's funny. Longer distance than twisted pair, for sure. This is what coax looks like. So you've got that center conductor, the foil shield, the braided shield is what's also used for the bidirectional communication. The dielectric in the outer jacket. That's RG6 right there. Now this isn't testable, I don't think. It's just interesting. The different types of coaxial cable, these are standards, so RG6U. You see the maximum attenuation decibels over 100 feet. That's that attenuation. That's the degradation of the signal. The shields, it's interesting stuff. That's why I included it here. Kind of cool stuff to geek out about potentially. Twisted pair. So shielded twisted pair and unshielded twisted pair, and they look different. You can see the twisting. The twisting is also a dampener to prevent crosstalk. It also does allow a little bit further transmission, but it makes it more resistant to crosstalk and EMI, electromagnetic interference. So the shielded twisted pair, it has that shield. It's got the pairs. Each pair is shielded. Each pair of cables or wires is shielded, as well as the outer shield. Whereas you've got unshielded twisted pair, which is the most common used today. The twisted pairs are just color coded in their own plastic insulation, but they're just all within that outer jacket. They're wound really tight now, so you get better protection and better and longer distances, higher speeds, all that stuff. And then you've got fiber. You've got the fiber core, the glass cladding, which isn't really glass anymore. It's in most cases it's plastic. You've got the buffer, and then you've got the outer jacket. That's just simple visual on the different types of network cables. And I thought this was interesting too, because you can see the different twists and the different just the different number of cables, I guess. The outdoor cables are always going to be wound a little bit tighter than the indoor cables. You've got Cat 6 and Cat 5. If you look closely, you can see that the Cat 6 is wound tighter. So if you look at Cat 6 unshielded twisted pair, second row down, third from the left, and Cat 5E unshielded twisted pair, it's pretty obvious which one's wound tighter. So just again, interesting stuff for you. This is more testable for us. So we've got 100 base TX. So what 100 means is that's the speed, 100 megabits per second. The base is baseband. There's baseband and broadband communication. All these are baseband. Ethernet is a baseband technology. And then the T or TX is the cabling type, essentially. So, you can see the different speeds, the cable type, unshielded twisted pair fiber. You see there is no shielded twisted pair in this particular table. Maximum speed, the transmission distance, so 100 for most of them, and then the cabling types. You can see down on the bottom, the multi-mode fiber, single mode fiber, just see the slight difference between the different fiber cables. Should be helpful for the exam. Probably not going to get tested on 10G base EW, but there it is. 40,000 meters, so 40 kilometers. How far you can run that cable according to the standard. Pretty cool. All right, network topologies. So got cables, different equipment for different things. Now it's the actual layout, right? You've got two types of layouts for topologies. You've got the physical layout and you've got the logical layout. It couldn't be more obvious than in a ring topology, because a ring topology is a physical, 99% of the time, it's a physical star, meaning everything connects to a central point. So everything branches out from the star, but it's a logical ring. And the way that works is it goes in one port, out the other, in one port, out the other. So logically, it's a big ring. Physically, it's a star, right? So that's a ring network. No data collisions because there's no contention for the network. There's no carrier sense multiple access collision detection or collision avoidance here. It's a token passing technology in most cases. So you have to have the token if you're going to communicate. If there's a break in a ring, if it was truly a physical ring, then a break in the ring would take the entire network down. But in a logical ring, physical star, you can lose a port and even lose a token and configure your multi-station access unit, which is that main thing in the middle, to regenerate a ring after some amount of time. Token ring is IEEE 802.5, and this is what it looks like. So logically, that MAU is multi-access unit. I'm used to the MSAU, multi-station access unit, same thing. They do the same thing. So it goes in one, out the other, in one, out the other, in one, out the other. And that's what creates the logical ring, but physically you can see it's a star. Now, normally you wouldn't have 4 multi-station access units there. You could have 1 multi-station access unit and have it all in one system. But hopefully that makes sense on how that all works. The bus topology. So the bus topology was the old Ethernet, the original sort of Ethernet topology. Xerox, I think, was the original, maybe. Anyway, this was just one long cable and everything would tap into the cable. You'd have to have termination on both ends. Otherwise, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't have the voltage terminated. It wouldn't work. So you have the terminators on both ends, and then you'd have these things called vampire taps. This is what a vampire tap looks like. So a vampire tap would essentially, you'd screw it down into the wire until it hit that cable, the copper. So this is coax, until it hit the cable, and that's how you would communicate. That's a vampire tap. You can see this Centricom 470 IEEE 802.3 transceiver. That's what it looks like. That's a bus topology. Now the thing about a bus topology is if there's a break in the line and it's not terminated, the entire network goes down. So it was not very resilient. It didn't scale well either. You'd have to run new. You'd have to continually run new cable runs. It was back in the day. It was fun back then, but so you won't see probably bus networks much anymore, but you probably see it on the test. Star topology. So star topology is what we're pretty much used to. That's kind of the way Ethernet works now. You've got a central system, a central connection point, a switch that is controlling, and everybody just connects to the switch. And then you've got multiple layers of switches. So you could have distribution layer switches, core switches, and usually it's access layer distribute. The old Cisco way was, 3-layer switch architecture. You'd have distribution, you have access layer switches, distribution switches, and core switches, and everything would just kind of branch out from there. That would still be a star topology. The single point of failure is limited because if any one of these stations goes down in that diagram, it's not going to take the network down. The switch, you took the switch down potentially, but in most cases, depending on what layer of the network we're in, that switch would be redundant anyway. So even that would, we don't have a single point of failure. So much more resilient, expandable, all that kind of stuff. The other network topology, we've got mesh topologies. So a full mesh topology, super highly resilient because every single station is connected to every single other station. So any network link goes down, you can route through another station and still, it's super duper resilient, but very expensive and complicated to run and certainly complicated to secure. So full mesh topologies beyond, just a few nodes are really, really rare. Partial mesh topologies are a little bit more common, where you might have certain high availability systems, critical systems that might be meshed with other systems. So it's got multiple paths through the network in case something goes down, so people can still use that critical system. This is a mesh topology. And you've got hybrid topology. So essentially take these topologies I just mentioned and munch them together. Pretty uncommon unless you're in an enterprise network or maybe a manufacturing type environment where you've got a polling type system, mainframe, something like that. These hybrid topologies, just taking them and putting them together. All right, network access control. So that's it. We've covered firewalls, different devices, cable types, topologies, all good stuff. Now network access control. Network access control is the one place that still haunts me today because I bought into network access control without knowing what was all involved in network access control, because the technology was very intriguing, but I didn't realize I needed probably 2 staff members to maintain the network access control system that I bought. So it ended up being shelfware. That was, a lesson learned. So network access control, in order to do network access control correctly, you really have to plan well. You have to lay out what are the policies going to be? How are we going to manage it? So are we going to do pre-admission network access control in some areas, all areas, or post-admission, or both? What are we going to do with the policy enforcement? What is the policy going to be? Policies would be things like you need to have this specific configuration, you need to have this specific type of software, or even this specific software, this specific antivirus definition, whatever it is. So anything you can see on a network, you can enforce with network access control. Realize that the stronger the policy, the more complex it is, the more chances of mistake, and the slower it's going to be. But whatever you want for the policies, what we're going to allow on the network, what we're not going to allow, the things that are not going to be allowed, are we just going to deny it outright? Place them in a quarantine, give them, with restricted access so that they can still go and get the required policy elements, maybe, from a specific server. So that's part of the quarantine, or maybe just outbound to the internet, then go download and install these things. That's sort of how a quarantine would work. Or in some cases, they stay in quarantine until an administrator manually inspects and releases from quarantine. That's just another way you can run your policies. Restricted access. So, based on these things that you have in place, you can access these things on the internal network. You can go wild crazy with network access control policies. Cisco did, for sure. That's their ICE system. Yeah, so network access control, that's enough for the test. And then you have other considerations. And I put the free Wi-Fi Starbucks thing there, because that is a captive portal by definition, but the one that you're probably going to run for network access control is probably going to be a little bit different. But it's essentially a place where you stop them. They can't do anything until they agree to specific things or whatever with your captive portal. You've got agent versus agentless. It's a matter of preference and capabilities. Agent typically gives you more control, but it's got more overhead, whereas agentless, typically a little less control. Out of band versus inline, so you can put your network access control almost as because this is what most people end up doing with their network access control. They have every intention of going inline, meaning active enforcement, but they never make that final click, like they continue to run in learning mode forever and never actually go into enforcement. That's sort of out of band versus inline. Inline it's actually going to start restricting things and stopping things, whereas out of band is typically just going to monitor things. You could make out of band active enforcement and inline passive enforcement as well, but that's typically what it is. Remediation, where you're going to put things. There are so many different ways to run network access control. It's insane. You name it, you can do it. But other things, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I've got 43 slides, so we're going to go fast now. But this is, whatever. It's not super exciting stuff, and it's more memorization than anything else. So implementing secure communication channels, I'll slow down where I think we really want to focus, but voice, the old PBX systems, enterprise class phone system, internal switching network, they're not just analog. There are digital, PBX systems as well, and PBX systems that run over voice over IP. So they've really blended. But the traditional PBX system was all analog, and it was a switching system, much like what the telephone company had, except for you had your own kind of telephone company at your company. This is a good reference. This is back from 2001. Brian Waldrop wrote a great paper on it, in my opinion, and the link is going to be there, so you can go check it out. Common threats to PBXs and voicemail systems, theft of service, for sure. We would call that typically phreaking, where we would use your phone service. I used to do this stuff before I realized you could get paid to do good stuff. So I've been forgiven. Statute of limitations is gone now, so we're good. Disclosure of information, certainly eavesdropping in on conversations, data modification, unprivileged access, denial of service, traffic analysis. These are all things that you can do with common threats to PBX systems. The rule of thumb is anything that I have physical access to, anything that an attacker has physical access to is compromised. It's just a matter of time. Physical access gives you so many opportunities to tweak things and do things and mess around with things. So PBX systems, physical access to a PBX system, consider it compromised. So keeping the switch room really secure, keeping the printouts and the documentation around the PBX system, keeping that really secure. Over time, we didn't want to go into the office, go into the switch room. So we provided remote access. Some of those were never turned off. Some of those were set to defaults and default configurations, made it really easy to access all sorts of PBX systems. Typically, this was dial-up modem. So we would war dial until you found something that listened and, oh, that's interesting. And then you had remote access into a PBX system. That's how that works. Direct inward system access. This is where we can place calls internally and move them amongst different places. That was interesting. Call forwarding, through dialing. These are all common vulnerabilities. PBX systems, that's an old PBX sort of system with the cards and all that good stuff. Plain old telephone service, residential. So the difference between POTS and PBX is PBX was actually an exchange. It was a switching system, whereas POTS was typically just an access system. You still had essentially a PBX. You still have the switch system, but the switch system was maintained by the phone company. So the same sorts of attacks that you could do against PBX systems, you could also do against POTS. The other thing about POTS, though, is it made it pretty easy to tap into and eavesdrop, because essentially anywhere between here and the central office, you could listen in. So those are physical controls are really, really important in POTS and PBX systems. We also have voice over IP. This is where we encapsulate the voice communication and make it so we can send it over IP networks. So instead of it being analog, we convert the analog into digital, because my voice, me talking, is still analog. This is analog communication. So me talking right now, it gets converted into digital by drivers and what have you, the equipment, and then gets encapsulated and sent over an IP network. Voice over IP works, essentially the same exact way. Configured correctly, it's generally more secure in landlines because I have more capabilities to encrypt things. But again, you have to configure it correctly. This is just a typical diagram of a voice over IP type of network, and where you'd have your VoIP gateways and all that other stuff. You still have the publicly switched telephone network down in the bottom right. That may or may not be analog. It depends on what the phone company has done. But you've got voice over IP applications. You've got them on your phones, your iPads, your everything. Right, is now essentially voice enabled. seems. So the IP device caller breaks it down into packets, sends the packets over the internet, reassembled at the other side. That's how it works. Pretty basic. One of the main protocols for voice over IP is the secure real-time transport protocol. This is, you've also got a SIP, a session initiation protocol, which can also be compromised. But SRTP is kind of the granddaddy of voice over IP because it allows me to do encryption and sequencing and all kinds of other things. So this is where you get your true security out of voice over IP. That's good for that. So compromises or threats around voice over IP, packet sniffing for sure. If you haven't set up your SRTP correctly, or if it's not encrypting data, packet sniffing is a piece of cake. You just need to get in line somewhere in a hub, a trunk line, whatever. Black hole attacks, essentially sending, yeah, sort of the same thing. DDoS attacks, phishing, but with voice, malware, viruses, you can inject that into voice over IP networks. Phreaking attack, which I mentioned before, typically with that, PBX systems, more SPIT. You may not have heard of SPIT before. That's spam over IP telephony. And then Vomit. Vomit's a voice over IP hacking tool if you're interested in such things. Some of this might be on the test. Vomit won't be, SPIT won't be, but I think it's important to know. Remote meetings. So remote meetings now, especially because everything, COVID, man, I mean, everything changed. It went nuts. So now everybody does remote meetings, very, very popular. Some people are never coming back to the office, so it's not going away. But it changed, it shifted a whole bunch of things for us that we maybe thought of, but didn't really think of. With regards to privacy, a lot of times when you don't turn on cameras, you don't know if somebody's on the other side listening. You don't know if it's truly the person that they say they are on the other side. It's not the same as when they were physically present. Those are all issues. The discussions that take place on remote meetings are all susceptible to, are all at risk one way or another, whether it be theft or confidential information. Some meetings that are held are really, really confidential. You don't want anybody to hear the things that are being discussed in meetings. But if it's not configured correctly, that's a big deal. Meeting hijackings. It's if we probably all heard of Zoom bombing, all that stuff. There's a good link there for CISA. They do have some good guidance on securing video conferencing, and this is just a screenshot of what that looks like. Zoom bombing, that's the unwanted. Somebody just kind of shows up in your meeting. That was really popular at the beginning. I mean, Zoom, if you remember Zoom prior to COVID, they were there and they were good and everything. But man, once COVID hit, that company exploded. And there are all kinds of issues. Some of them were manufactured issues too, because I think other, remote meeting companies they saw their business going, here. But good guidance here on how to prevent yourself or prevent some of the Zoom bombing. Instant messaging, I just took top risks. You can talk about instant. All of these are not all inclusive, right? There are way more risks than we could cover in 2 hours or 2 days together. So the top risks I just took, and there's the link for that. Top risks for instant messaging, viruses and worms over instant messaging, identity theft, authentication, spoofing, that can happen over instant messaging. And each one of these, as you go through the notes, you can read through it, right? And get a little more context. Firewall tunneling. Firewall tunneling is essentially using the IAM client to find your way out of the network. So I may have really good egress filtering on my firewall, but I allow IAM. Well, IAM can also be used to transfer data or files. So that's a way out potentially. Data security leaks kind of along that same lines, and spam. There it is again. Yeah, spam through instant messaging. So those are your, top risks for instant messaging. Email. Oh my gosh, we could spend all day on email. Email arguably is the #1 entry point into corporate networks. It's the beginning of many attack vectors. Phishing for sure, right? It's trivial to get internal access to most environments because of email. Email back in the day used to be just a messaging protocol. We would just send messages. Then it became a file storage thing. And so it's definitely changed a lot over the years. It is a social engineer's paradise. It's the easiest way to get files into an organization in many cases. The protocols that are, I think, most common to email, SMTP. SMTP is just used essentially to send email. It's a store and forward protocol, which got timers set in, whatever. TCP port 25, you'll want to know that for the test. You may not need to know TCP 587. Sometimes SMTP can be or is configured that way. You can run encrypted SMTP over port 25 just fine. POP3, TCP port 110, 995 for SSL or TLS. POP3 is just like it sounds. You pop the email off the server. So typically when you pop mail, you're taking it from the server. Now you can configure to leave the mail on the server, but it's a very simple protocol to just access the mail and get it. IMAP is a little bit more persistent. IMAP is more complicated. Internet Mail Access Protocol is what IMAP stands for. And you can interact and read the emails, manipulate the emails, move the emails, all with that persistence when you're using IMAP. So IMAP has a little more security concern than POP3. IMAP also allows you to synchronize across mailboxes. So basic stuff that you need to know for email. So many email providers, man. SendMail, Exchange. Some people still running on-premise Exchange servers. Office 365 exploded in popularity. Gmail for sure. Tons of different email providers, and each one of them will have its own security sort of requirements and configuration. So depending on what you're using, Exchange took a beating. On-prem Exchange took a beating over the last 12 months and still is because of the vulnerabilities involved. So be aware of what technology you're using. Attacks are sometimes focused on the server or service itself, i.e. some of the Exchange stuff over the last 12 months or so. Typically vulnerabilities are found in one of these three areas, right? When you talk about email, it's a poor configuration, it's unpatched or outdated, so there's software flaws that are on the server, whether there are patches available or not, the flaw is there. And then you've got the user mistakes, right? And it's not always the end user. Admins make plenty of mistakes. And really, when you think about it, we're the ones who delivered the mail to the end user. So think about that for a minute. It's not them, it's us together, right? Your server is not an open relay. That's another thing, right? If it is an open relay, my server could potentially be used, my mail server could potentially be used to send spam. It's pretty common. So require authentication for if you do need to have any relay, require authentication. And then there's certainly some DNS protections we can put in place. DMARC, others. Email, start with policy. Always start with policy. Always, always, everything you do, start with policy. Acceptable use, access control, privacy, email backup retention policies are all critical policies. I crossed out the word guidelines because acceptable use policy is not guidelines, they're requirements. There's me being literal again, but it's really important. Policies are requirements, they're mandatory. I have every intention as a CISO to enforce the policies, and that's what I tell management. So don't approve it if you don't want me to enforce it. Or you can always find somebody else. So email, some other considerations. These are protections of email, typically in transit. So secure mail or secure multi-purpose internet mail exchange or extensions is SMIME for short. So you probably hear SMIME. This is an open standard. It's widely accepted. SMIME has been around for quite a while. Uses PKI, so public key encryption, digital signatures to authenticate mail, encrypt the mail. X.509 is just a signature standard for, actually it's a structure standard for digital certificates for providing authentication. Two types of messages can be formed using SMIME: signed messages and enveloped messages. The differences between the two is one's got non-repudiation. The signed message has non-repudiation. The enveloped message just protects the integrity and confidentiality. It also has some sender authentication. The signed has an additional function where we'll insert a hash into it. So important things to remember about SMIME: signed messages, envelope messages, meant to protect the message itself, usually integrity and confidentiality. Other types: MIME object security services, that's MOS, probably not going to run into it. A little bit older, uses MD2 and MD5 for hashing, RSA and DES, so it's weak stuff, but it is in the book, so I figured I would cover it quick. Privacy enhanced email, PEM, a little more common than MOS, but also weak and probably shouldn't be used. Domain keys identified, DKIM, this is widely used and should be, all your mail servers should be set up with DKIM. Essentially, it validates that your mail server is the right mail server to send from your domain or your organization. So DKIM is a best practice that should be implemented. It relies on public keys and digital signing. So you have to go get yourself a certificate from a CA. Well, you could self-sign as well, but you're not going to have nearly as much success. PGP has been around forever. PGP ever, 91. Think about PGP, Web of Trust. So this doesn't require on a central certificate authority. It's more of a public-private system, amongst all the participants in PGP. It's not a standard. It used to be free, but now it's been bought by Symantec. So you have to pay for it, but there are still open source versions, yay. But PGP is still very much used today. Phil Zimmerman, 1991. Remote access, I've got 18 more slides, so stick with me. 3 minutes, 18 slides. We're gonna go a little bit over, but I'm having so much damn fun. I don't wanna stop. Remote access. Man, you can talk forever about this too. 3 types, I guess, many types, but 3 of the most common types of, well, 4, actually, 5. Think about it. Okay, so service specific. So service specific is I'm just accessing a specific service, a specific application, not full control or full access to things. OWA is a really common service specific type of remote access. You could probably fit OneDrive in here as well when you access it from the web, that kind of stuff. Other time and attendance applications for sure would be service specific. Remote control, RDP, you'll want to know RDP runs TCP port 3389 by default. Yeah, RDP is highly targeted. So anytime we see RDP, specifically if it's running, single factor authentication, that's a ripe target, and it's hard to justify it sitting there like that. Windows Terminal Server, numerous other applications would all be remote control. So remote control means you remote into something and you control that something. That's remote control, remote access. And then screen scraping is you access something remotely and you can copy data off the screen from one application into another application. Unauthorized disclosure, it's sort of hard to secure it beyond enabling it or not enabling it. So if you turn it on, it's hard to secure it. The best way is just to not turn it on. So, but that's what screen scraping is. Remote access management, strong authentication. So when we talk about strong, we're talking multi-factor authentication. That's strong. So something you have, something you know, something you have, something you are. 2 of those. Some people make a case for the 4th one, but I'm a stickler for the 3. Multi-factor authentication for all remote access. Period, because it's just too susceptible to compromise. Limit remote access to only those who need it. So enabling remote access for a whole bunch of accounts or they never ever remote access anything or need to, especially vendors, third parties. That should not happen. Implement encryption for data in transit from point A to point B. And VPN is not a complete security solution. It's part of a solution. There is never a complete security solution besides just not having it to begin with, maybe. You can't, there's no easy button in any of this, which is why we get paid so much money. All right, so this just came from the book. This is just a copy and paste of this particular diagram. Yeah, I'm not gonna go into that. So remote access authentication, different ways to authenticate. Radius will be on there. Radius has been around forever. Remote authentication dial-in user service, or Radius. Radius is a client server architecture, but the client isn't like the person remoting in. Sometimes that gets a little confusing. The client is actually the network access server. That's the one that you connect to. It is the client to a background Radius server that will actually do the authentication. It has the capabilities for authentication, authorization. So first that's identity, authentication, then authorization, and then accounting. So Radius can do all of that stuff from a centralized database. Radius is cool. It's been around forever. So this is just, a very simple network architecture of what Radius looks like. So you can see the network access server, that's the Radius client, not the dial-in client, not the user. That's just the dial-in client, but it's not part of the Radius architecture. Then along came Diameter. Now, because Radius had some, and still does have some issues, right? And this is just a good, I think, table of the difference between Radius and Diameter. Diameter evolved from Radius. You see the play on words here? Radius is like, see like a circle. Radius, diameter is, they're different, right? But it's enhanced Radius protocol. It uses TCP, whereas Radius uses UDP. UDP is unreliable, TCP is reliable. Both open standards, 2865 is Radius, Diameter. Two different standards, 6733 being the latest. Just a lot more extensibility in Diameter. Then TechX. TechX is Terminal Access Controller Access Control System. You don't have to memorize that. TechX is what it is. TechX, 3 flavors of TechX. TechX itself is no longer used anywhere that I've seen. Extended TechX, also not used anywhere. Everything is pretty much migrated now to TechX Plus, which is the latest. It's extensible. Cisco developed this because, well, they were Cisco, first of all, but I think there was also some frustration around Radius's ability to do more extensibility. So TechX Plus gave more extensibility, including the ability to use extensible authentication protocols. EAP, you've probably heard, 2-factor authentication, also used for TechX. And the difference between Radius and TechX, I thought was important to display. You can see UDP versus TCP, different elements, and much more secure. The big thing on Radius is encrypting only the password. And even in the initial setup of the communication, you can get Radius not to set up the initial communication at all to be encrypted. Still the password, it's hard to get that, but anyway, full command logging, all that stuff. TechX is definitely a better, option. PPTP, so these are VPN protocols. PPTP has been around forever. PPTP was built natively into Windows 95, which gave you the ability to, you could connect between 2 Windows 95 devices, but typically it was from a Windows 95 to a Windows NT device. So this is old. It's a data link layer, so layer 2. Easy to configure, pretty fast, but also very easily compromised. Low encryption level, the least secure of the VPN protocols. Known vulnerabilities, government has definitely had their way with it. So Not recommended, but still in use today, for sure. It was developed originally from PPP, and I think PPP, point-to-point protocol, was probably something you guys covered last week. It uses the same authentication protocols as PPP. So MS CHAP, that's the challenge handshake authentication protocol, where the password is never sent across between the two systems. Same with CHAP, challenge handshake authentication protocol. PAP, you never want to see PAP. That's password authentication protocol. PAP is not encrypted. Clear text, bad, don't use it. Extensible authentication protocol allows you to do all kinds of cool things if you wanted to. Shiva, not really common, but it can also be used. Session establishment, the initial session with PPTP. Actually, that's a misspelling. It's not PTPP, it's PPTP. So my bad, it's not encrypted. Secure socket tunneling, just another protocol, not in the book, but it is one that you might see in the wild, but you probably won't see it on the test. So I'll just keep moving. Frame relay is old. Frame relay is a packet switched network, but it emulates a circuit switch network. So it's kind of cool. You've got PVCs, permanent virtual circuits, and switched virtual circuits. But frame relay's been around for a long time. It is still in use today. Operates at layer 1 and layer 2, usually used across wide area networks. So we would use frame relay from 2 LANs to connect them. Started as ISDN Integrated Services Data Network. My dad actually, believe it or not, worked on the original ISDN standard back for Northern Telecom back in late 70s, 80s, early 80s. Anyway, ISDN was the first technology really where we could send data over copper, plain old telephone service, essentially almost natively, and data over the same copper. So devices performing frame relay services. So 2 things to remember about frame relay. You've got DCEs and DTEs, data circuit terminating equipment, which is in the carrier, right? That's typically, that would be the DMARC. So you might have one on-prem, but that would be where their network ends and your network begins. And then everything that you have connecting to the DCE is called DTE, or data terminal equipment. That's the difference with frame relay. That's the important stuff to remember. You're probably not going to have to configure frame relay unless you go into telco work. ATM, high speed asynchronous transfer mode, has been around for a long time too. The thing about ATM was, and is, it's very predictable. You can start making routing and forwarding decisions immediately, because every ATM PDU is called a cell, and it's 53 bytes. So it's very predictable, very easy to do QoS, quality service, on ATM networks. Usually ISPs over long haul. Yeah, ATM. This is the 53 bytes and what it looks like. So 48, this looks a little confusing because you have 48 bytes and then you got bits all up on top. If you add the bits together, you'll find the 5 bytes to make your 53 bytes for the ATM. But it's already making forwarding decisions on the first 5 bytes because it already knows it's going to end at the 53, which is just it was a beautiful design because it made it so much faster. So things you might see with ATM. So if you've ever seen OC, that's optical carrier, OC 192, 10 gigabits per second. Probably not going to see that. OC3 is pretty common, 155 megabits per second. OC12, 622. This was a lot bigger deal back in the day when you're like, oh my God, you got an OC3, or you had a DS3. So that DS3 wasn't ATM. DS3 was essentially almost T1. It was over copper. Quality service of 4 basic types. You have constant bit rate, variable bit rate, available bit rate, and unspecified bit rate. And it's from reliability. Those are ordered from reliability top down. So constant bit rate, you would pay a premium for this because you got preference on the carrier's network. Variable bit rate, a little less preference, but still pretty expensive. Unspecified bit rate is essentially you get what's left. Get the table scraps. Oh boy, I'm done. All right, 10 minutes late. That's not so bad. But morphine homework, if you can, review domain 4. If you don't have a chance to read it all page for page, that's okay. Just review it, skim it for now. Like I said it early on, don't get overwhelmed. You're never going to learn it all. You know, it's always a learning process. So just take your time, skim it if you need to skim it. We're going to be moving on to domain 5 on Wednesday. Take practice tests, monkey around. Practice tests, the focus now should not be passing practice tests. The focus now should be getting familiar answering questions. That's what you should be focusing on. I gave 5 or 6 references in the slide deck. Check them out, download them, use them as your own reference later on, and post a question. I challenge each one of you guys to post a single question on the Slack channel. I'm keeping track. If you don't, you don't want to find out. Just do it. That's it. Have a good night. Take care, everybody.